fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren.
Heard on KCAA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Caught that show, Manhunt, Unabomber, and very interesting case. And if you've seen the series, there's a person there that does the linguistics. He's the guy that figured out and matched who the Unabomber was. And we're quite lucky to actually have him with us. Now, I also want to mention that he's been writing books, and it's A Journey to the Center of the Mind book series. And I believe he's got 3 volumes out now. We'll talk to him about that. So who we've got here is James Fitzgerald. Thank you for sitting in with us.
Hey, Alan, and hi, Kevin. It's great to be on board with you guys today.
Hey, welcome aboard.
Thank you.
So that's, of course, the series is getting a lot of attention now, but let's talk about your history. Let's talk about you. How did you get into doing forensic linguistics? How did that happen?
Well, Alan, and since you already mentioned my books, I did decide to finally put into writing this a question, similar to yours that I've been asked hundreds and hundreds of times, both while I was still an FBI agent and now that I'm in retirement, more or less retirement. I'm still pretty busy. But I decided to put it on paper. Even my kids would have questions for me. How did this happen, Dad? And how did you make this decision? So, and the best way to answer it is I had parents who they themselves didn't go past high school in life, but they made sure their youngest son went to college. But even well before that, my parents were avid readers. My father, reading a couple of newspapers every day. He always had a book. He liked history, biographies, things like that. My mother was into crossword puzzles, and at a very early age, she taught me how to do crosswords. And sometimes I would grab the paper before her, and she'd kiddingly, "Jimmy, you beat me to it." But then she taught me the game of Scrabble, and to this day, I still play. Last night, I was watching the football game and playing Scrabble at the same time, and I tend to beat the computer most of the time, depending on my letter choice, etc. And then, and I got into cryptograms a little bit after that. So, I went to college, Penn State, and I got a master's degree at Villanova in psychology. But you're right, it is this kind of a strange turn of events. I really had no formal training in language or linguistics or anything to do with it. I studied Spanish for 4 years, and even being exposed to a different language teaches you some things about your native language. So, but I'll tell you what too is when I was about 11 years old, my parents would always talk about to them the crime of the century. Now this is well before OJ in the 20th century, and to them, coming of age in the 20s and 30s in the U.S., the crime of the century was the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. Of course, that happened not too far from where I grew up in Philadelphia, probably about 25 miles as the crow flies, and I think it's Hopewell, New Jersey, not far from Princeton. And to them, Lindbergh being the biggest hero in the world at the time, first to fly solo across the Atlantic, then 5 years later or so, his little baby is kidnapped, and who knows, nobody knows what happened to him. And it's the New Jersey State Police or the FBI didn't even investigate kidnappings back then. But anyway, this is like in the early 60s, a book comes out called Kidnap, not the past tense kidnapped, by Robert Louis Stevenson. And my dad, you should read that book. So I went to the Philadelphia Free Library, the local branch, and it was the first adult book I ever checked out. I think I had to get a special permission from my parents or something, because I was usually just getting kids' books out before that. And I brought this book home, and it probably took me the better part of 2 weeks to read it. I'm still going to school and all. And I just found it fascinating how an investigation can start with nothing. There's a handmade ladder up against the house. There's no baby. There's a note. And some reason, doing the crossword puzzles with my mom and Scrabble, I focused on the note and pictures of the note, and there were clues in the note that the author was most likely a native speaker of German language. It's kind of obvious looking back at it. He uses the word gut, G-U-T, for good, which, and that is the German word for good. So I just became fascinated, and at least one part of that investigation focused on language. And I think they had some English professor or someone, he wasn't even a linguist back then, look at the various letters that went in. And for some reason in my life, just language was always important to me. Flashing ahead, I'm a police officer for 11 years. I'm an FBI agent for 7 years in New York. I get promoted to the profiling unit in Quantico. I spend 12 weeks in training there, and the first case I'm assigned is Unabomber as a brand new profiler. And I had to go back and say, all right, what do I depend on at the task force in San Francisco? My 15-plus years of being a gumshoe investigator as a police detective, FBI agent in New York, my 12 weeks under my belt now of profiling training, where all of a sudden we have this manifesto thing and these 13 other letters written before that by the Unabomber. I'm wondering if that language hobby I sort of have and looking for clues and how to solve puzzles involving language, I wonder if that'll somehow, pay off here. And Alan and Kevin, actually, it did.
Yeah.
But what a welcome, the Unabomber. Here, toss it in your lap.
Well, yeah, and the investigation had been going on for 17 years already. This is 1995. The first bombing was in Chicago in 78. He wasn't even called the Unabomber until the early 80s, just in case people haven't watched the series or read my third book yet, in which I devote the long final chapter to my role in the Unabom case. Unabom is an acronym which stands for University Airline Bombings, because the early targets of the Unabomber, I think the first 6 or so, were either universities or airlines or some version of that. So that's where the name came from. Some unknown bureaucrat in the FBI came up with that acronym. And not only was the case called Unabom, but the person responsible for the actual bombing became the Unabomber. So yes, it was my first case ever assigned as a profiler. And as I was flying out to San Francisco on my maiden voyage there, I went back and forth a lot from Quantico to San Fran. I'm reading this manifesto, and that's for the first time I started coming up with some clues, some ideas, and saying, this guy's a different kind of criminal, and if we're going to catch him, it may depend on looking at the words he's been using. And that's exactly what I did.
One thing I noticed, too, throughout the series that you're in, as well as going through the mine hunters and stuff like that and profiling and all of this, there seemed to be a real uphill battle for you to kind of almost prove that this was a valid way of profiling and finding out someone and who they were. Is it still that hard? It looked really hard. All the other FBI was just kind of going, well, we want real evidence,
Well, you're absolutely right, Alan. And the problem was, for 17 years, real evidence wasn't working. In fact, there really was none. This criminal mastermind, who we only knew as the Unabomber, he left no clues on the devices themselves, on the IEDs that provides explosive devices. No fingerprints, no hairs and fibers, no early days of DNA, nothing there. And the same with the letters that he wrote. And there were the first 2 were actually what I came to call the ruse letters, R-U-S-E, because they accompanied the package with the bomb in it, and they sort of tricked the recipient into opening the package. And then after that, he had his little sabbatical from 87 to 93, where he didn't bomb at all, no letters, nothing. And then in 93 came back with a passion, with bombs that killed as well as letters that made it very specific. Here's why here's we. He used the plural pronoun, although we were convinced one person. Here's why we are doing this. We are a group called FC. And oh, yes, we have a bargain for you in the New York Times. Print this article. So which I eventually had to argue to get in. But I think your initial question was, change is hard for anyone to accept. And quite frankly, I'm brand new with the Unabomber task force. We're all FBI agents, but I'm brand new to San Francisco. I didn't know anybody there. There was one guy I graduated from the academy with, 7 or so years before, but he wasn't even on the task force. And all of a sudden, I'm just thrust into the middle of this thing. All right, Fitzgerald, you're the profiler. Tell us what you have here. Well, okay. Let me look at some of the earlier profiles written by John Douglas, not coincidentally. And I kind of took those, modified some there, but all of a sudden, I'll tell you what actually happened. And this was, I think, in the first episode of Manhunt Unabomber, because it really happened, is that I looked at the 1985 letter, the second of the two ruse letters that tricked Dr. McConnell at the University of Michigan into opening this package. And actually, it was his teaching assistant. It wasn't even him. And it blew up, and luckily they weren't killed, but seriously injured. I looked at that letter, and the series went over this real quick, I think in episode 1, but I was the first person to come out to the task force in all the years that this letter had been in their possession, 10 years, and I looked at it and said, has anybody here looked down the left-hand column of U2, as I called it, Unabomber document number 2? What do you mean, Fitz? And if you look down that letter from the address to the body to actually the fake signature at the bottom, it spells out 4 words. Dad, it is I.
Oh, wow.
And no one had ever picked up on this before. And I've always been a fan of E.E. Cummings and Lewis Carroll of, Alice in Wonderland. And even when I was a cop, I went through a couple of years, and this is all covered in my second book, of some real political malevolence within my department and some really bad guys harassing me and bullying me. And they would memo me every day on old-fashioned, pieces of paper you would type on a typewriter. And I would memo them back after a while. And the only way I can get even with them, because they were in charge, I couldn't really mess with them directly, I would write little messages in the left-hand column, like eat, S-H-I-T, I'm not sure I can say that one. Go to hell, drop dead, you suck. And these are all little messages I was sending off to this one lieutenant who was really harassing and bullying me. And it was my little way of having little victories every day. Yes, I told him to eat shit, and he doesn't even know about it. So here, I've always carried that with me. I've never done it since then. But I get to the Unabomber letters, and boy, this guy is so clever, 17 years without being caught. Let me look for some clues in the writing itself. There is Dad, it is I. This is like my second day on the Unabomber task force. It was like July 8th or 9th of 1995. And the boss, the big boss, the special agent in charge, said, "This is great, Fitz. No one's seen this in the 10 years we've had it. I'm putting you in charge of all the documents in this case." Okay. Thanks, boss, I think. And that's how it I know, that'll show me to come up with something innovative. But I'm actually glad they put that trust in me. And I wound up using, it was a strange time in my life, professionally speaking, because I was very comfortable as an investigator. Again, detective, special agent in New York City, working all kinds of mob cases, serial killer cases, terrorism type cases. And I really thought I was pretty darn good at that. But now I'm a 12-week profiler, and this is my first case, and all of a sudden language, kind of a hobby I've had for my entire life, is what now may be the most useful in this case. So you know what? I was not a linguist. I had no formal training in linguistics, but I decided to run with it, and before long, that is what actually helped solve this case.
So, Fitz, let's back up just a little bit, because you said a lot. And I sympathize with you. Law enforcement does seem to shy away from novel approaches. And I'm speaking as a law enforcement officer. For example, how many cops does it take to change a light bulb?
Usually it's an ethnicity put in that place, which we won't say now. I would.
But the answer is what? Change. So And we know, how behavioralists had such a difficult time in the FBI getting started. But what you were doing was even more novel, forensic linguistics. So for the sake of the listeners, can we kind of explain what that is? I mean, do you look at syntax? Do you look at regional or cultural dialects or phrases or euphemisms that are unique to certain areas?
Yes, and plenty more. Good question. And let me, despite, I'm telling people the miniseries is about 85% accurate. And when Hollywood writers get their hands on something, even though I sat with the head writer, Andrew Sadrowski, a good guy, great writer, and the director, here's the facts, here's an outline of my book chapter and everything, they still insisted on kind of switching a few things around here a little bit. So the one thing is there was no real Natalie character. She's sort of a composite of a real linguist, a Georgetown male professor, in Washington, D.C. I spent 2 hours with him before going out to the task force because they had given him an advanced copy of the manifesto. He went over some things with me, and I said, wow. And what are you again, sir? A linguist? Right. One who studies language. Okay. But I never actually used that term while on the UTF, UNABOM task force. I may have said I'm doing text analysis. I'm doing a comparative analysis eventually when the writings of Kaczynski came to us. So we kind of they kind of morphed ahead a little bit in the miniseries, putting me in contact with this Natalie character. On almost a daily or weekly basis by the miniseries, where in reality I had 2 hours with this professor out of Georgetown, and that was it. So I was really on my own. I found out, and this is kind of, you have to almost be part nerd if you really want to be a linguist, because you really have to sit and read things over and over and over again, and not always, in fact, sometimes rarely for comprehension's sake. I remember reading the manifesto the first time, and I still do this today if I'm working cases. I still work cases in the private sector with my company, and I'll read some threatening emails, some harassing emails or blog entries on some website somewhere, and I'll read it a few times, and I'm not even sure what the author wrote. So if I'm reading a book at night, for pleasure, of course I know what the author's writing and where he or she is going, whatever. But I'll read something when I'm actually being paid to do it, and all I'm looking for are some of the things you just brought up about syntactical construction, semantic usages, lexical features, certainly punctuation, other stylistic features, indicators of regionalisms throughout the U.S. or elsewhere. And these are all the things I do when I have an anonymous author and I'm trying to tell the client or the police officer or whomever, and say, all right, I think we have a female, probably middle-aged, a native English speaker, perhaps, college educated, not a present employee of your company, but maybe in the, not too distant past. And in more cases than not, the profile tends to be right on the money. The next step is they give you some known writings of that person. And I always ask for other employees too, so I have sort of a suspect pool. And then I'll go through those emails and look and say, you know what, based on these anonymous, blog entries on this website, this employee number 3 that you gave me, I think she is the author. So essentially, that's what I was doing at UNABOM, not knowing it was forensic linguistics. Of course, I knew forensic means, I think the Latin is, arguing in the courts or something like that. But certainly it's anything to do with investigations, the courts, the legal system, and whatever the next noun is, accounting, dentistry, language or linguistics, you name it, that's where that word comes together. So I quite frankly didn't know I was sort of, if not inventing something, at least sort of, bringing to bear or codifying up some work that had been done randomly before throughout the country, including by the professor I met, but usually on civil matters. Here was the first time in a criminal case where an actual criminal investigator, that was me, was taking language and trying to apply it to the resolution of a 17-year-old case. And as I said, a lot of things had to happen. A lot of pieces of the puzzle had to be put together. But eventually, it is language that brought down the Unabomber and helped us put the handcuffs on Theodore J. Kaczynski.
I was going to say now, there's a confusing part, not only in the Netflix show, but other profiles I've talked to. Now, Ted Kaczynski, did his brother willingly come forward and say, I think it's him, or not? Because I kind of get both stories. Okay.
The answer is yes. David Kaczynski willingly came forth. I never met David Kaczynski in real life, and some of your listeners are probably going to be, what? The miniseries showed you going to his door?
That's
no,
right.
I never did. Sorry. The writers took that and ran with it, and after a few arguments and refusing to answer emails, we finally agreed on, some compromises. But that's okay. Other agents, Fitz was a composite character in the series, and most of what the language part was basically all me, and there was really no Natalie character who was a linguist herself. I was conversing with or consulting with on a daily basis. So the bottom line is the story got this pretty well, pretty accurate in terms of, for the first time, the brand, the internet was pretty new in '95. The FBI had just started its FBI.gov website, I think, only months before. And I'm not even sure the Washington Post or the New York Times had the manifesto on their websites, but the FBI.gov site definitely did. And it was after it was published in the Washington Post on September 19th of '95, which was a whole other argument that I had to go through with the bosses in San Francisco. They finally agreed it should be published. Then we had to argue it on the Washington, D.C. end with the director, Louis Freeh, and Attorney General Janet Reno. And, of course, the New York Times people had to agree to it also, which they eventually did, although we wanted the Washington Post folks to do it instead for logistical reasons. Anyway, long story short, it all kind of came together with David. His wife is in Paris, France at a conference, and she goes on this, computer in the lobby of her hotel. For some curious reason, she checks on the FBI.gov site, goes into the manifesto, starts reading it, and boy, this is some weird language. Boy, this is strange. Boy, this reminds me of my brother-in-law, the guy I've never met who lives in a cabin by himself in Montana. She comes home a few days later. Hi, honey, and I kind of heard this, read the interview sheets from the other agents, and hey, honey, hey, great to have you home. We miss you. Love you. By the way, David, have you read the Unabomber's manifesto yet? What? You're barely in the door. You're asking me about this? And it was kind of a funny scene how it was told to us. And, well, no, why? You should, because all those letters over the years your brother has sent you, and I know you've saved, and I've read them, all these things about anti-technology and, the leftists are evil and big business is bad and all this stuff. It sounds a lot like the manifesto. And he basically said to his wife, oh, yeah, my brother, the Unabomber, Ted wouldn't hurt a fly. You got to be kidding. So there was no rush or no reason for him to, go into it the next day. I think 3 to 4 weeks went by. Finally, David sat down at his home computer, opened it up, and all right, well, Ted said that. Well, yeah, Ted refers to that stuff. But he hit on one term that all of a sudden, like 10 or 20 pages in, he said, he had that OMG moment where he said, this has to be Ted. And that term was the word cool-headed logician. Cool-headed logician. 2, I guess, words. The first one, I guess, technically hyphenated,
right,
as opposed to a dash. But anyway, I'm a linguist. I get hung up on that stuff. So I solve cases on whether someone uses a hyphen or a dash. So just to get that clear here.
No more writing here.
I told you it's nerdy sometimes, and don't get me on the counting points of ellipses. That's a whole other part of my my nerdy life when given a case. Actually counting the dots. But back to David. Yes, he did realize it, and at that point he said, I think the Unabomber is my brother Ted. I haven't seen him in a decade plus. I do have these letters. We don't even talk. He doesn't have a phone, so we don't talk. He went downstairs into some box in the basement where he kept all Dave's writings where Dave kept all of Ted's writings, and he pulled out this 23-page document from the early 70s, and he read it, and he said, this looks kind of similar. He wound up getting an attorney. The attorney talked to some people. Long story short, in February, remember now, the manifesto came out in September. Linda Patrick, David's wife, tells her husband about it, mid to late September. He finally looks at it mid-October. It wasn't until mid-February, maybe 20th or somewhere around there, that a lawyer calls an FBI agent in Washington, D.C., because that's where his law firm was, and said, hey, we have a guy who thinks his brother may be the Unabomber, and they pass along this 23-page document. It goes to the UTF. I'm now back, and the miniseries was right about this. They didn't really throw me out of the UTF after the thing was published and the surveillance, and we did all those things. We knew it may take a few more weeks or months for someone to read the manifesto and possibly identify the author. But by mid-December of '95, I had basically finished my task, and quite frankly, my bosses back in Quantico at the actual profiling, they wanted their new colleague back because they had cases, on my desk that were building up. So I finally go back in mid-December, say goodbye to everybody in San Francisco, and in mid-February of '96, they fax me, the boss faxes me this 23-page document, which they had done before over some other suspects, and I would look at it, compare it to my well-worn and marked-up copy of the manifesto, say, no, not that guy, no, not this guy. This 23-page document comes in. I said, oh, all right, you're faxing this to me. Who's it from? What's the background? Jim, on this one, we're not going to tell you anything about it. Just look at it, let us know what you think. So just like in the miniseries, I have to put this in here too. If you saw that scene, I'm in the movies with in a movie theater with my two older sons.
That's right.
And I get paged about this document, and boys, I'll be right back. I'm going to check something out. And then 4 hours later, my wife walks in. I don't know how she got into the FBI office with no escort, but she did. And there's Fitz on the floor with 50 pages of paper spread out. And you left your kids in the movie theater. And that's kind of when they split up. For the record, everybody, Alan and Kevin and all your listeners, I never left my kids in a movie theater. So it didn't happen that way, but of course it is more dramatic to show it that way and create some of the fiction that had been occurring at that point in my personal life, unfortunately, with no other women involved, just me being laser focused on this case. So I look at this document, 23 pages, pull out my manifesto copy, look at it, and I realize this is like an outline. The 23-page document is like a cliff notes of the manifesto. And I called the people out in San Francisco, and I made it very simple to them. I said, this is one of two things, and it's not both. First, it's an elaborate plagiarism. Someone took the manifesto that was published in the Washington Post, got some old paper, got an old typewriter, sat down and summarized it over 23 pages, or you got your man. They said, Fitz, we know it's not a plagiarism. It's 25 years old. You're coming back to San Francisco. That's when the next stage of the investigation started. That's when they identified a guy named Theodore Kaczynski, a former, mathematics professor at Berkeley, PhD mathematician, living in a cabin by himself in Montana, and he became the prime suspect. And that's when they said, Fitz, you're in charge of looking at Kaczynski's documents, comparing them to the Unabomber documents. Good luck.
So in the
that's
show,
how it all started.
Yeah, well, in the show too, you also it shows you talking to Ted. Did you actually talk to him like that and visit his little home when it was in the FBI with him?
No, that is fiction.
Okay.
And I argued against that, but I lost. And my only interaction, I spent a few pages in my third book writing on this, was in the courtroom on the day he was sentenced. I was in Sacramento in a federal courtroom, and we had a very interesting interaction for about a minute plus in the courtroom that day. But no, what the writers did, I was supposed to interview Ted Kaczynski 10 years after his arrest and conviction, in the Supermax in Florence. And it never actually came about, and I tell that story in my book too. But I did have a bunch of questions that I wrote down and saved all these years. So the writer took those questions and posed a lot of those that Fitz was asking Ted in those one-on-one sort of situations there. They also borrowed from, Ted was really resistant to his own defense counsel. He didn't want to work with them at all. He didn't trust them. He eventually realized he had no choice, and we were aware of some of the issues he was causing them. So a lot of those scenes between Ted and Fitz, it's a combination of what I would have asked him 10 years later. Again, that interview fell through, or what his attorneys were going through with him at the time. And the last part is, from a Hollywood perspective, they had two A-lister actors, if not, A+, certainly A-, in Sam Worthington, who portrayed me, and Paul Bettany, who portrayed Ted Kaczynski. And they just felt they had to give them screen time together. And I think in the long run, for the telling of this story, I think it made sense. I think it made for a better drama and a better miniseries.
Wow. Some of these.
So I gotta ask this because it's rolling through my head. And after all of this was over, have you looked at any other cases that where writings take center stage? For example, the Zodiac. Once his puzzle or his riddle was solved, the crypto that he used. Have you ever looked at any of that?
That's a good question, Kevin. But it's that's really code breaking and cryptanalysis. And I know I said I do some of the puzzles and all, but that's really a whole different aspect of looking at language. In fact, he didn't even use letters; he used characters. And I did. So I never worked that case officially. It was never presented to me. I certainly saw the movie. I thought it was a good movie. And I certainly read about the case. And I don't think all of his, secret messages have been deciphered to this point in time. I think there's some where he says, he wrote in English, "My name is," and he uses a character, his character representations. I don't think that's ever been accurately deciphered. So no, that's a bit different than what I do, but I think you started this your query here with, yes, I've worked many other cases in which language played a major role. Probably the next big one was the John Benet Ramsey case and the 3-page letter that was left at the crime scene. Of course, it never was a kidnapping. It was a murder in the house. And then, of course, after that was 9/11. I reviewed the writings of Muhammad Atta. And I was one of the first people, and I put this on paper, to say I think he actually fooled his fellow hijackers into thinking they were going to hijack the planes and land them somewhere. I don't think they necessarily knew they were on a death mission. Maybe the pilots did, but not the other people that were working for them. And after that, of course, the anthrax case, I put a lot of time and effort into that with the writings. Wasn't a whole lot to go on there. And but most prominently, in which I think I really helped solve a case, or at least bring it tighter together, was the D.C. sniper case, in which numerous letters were left behind at the crime scenes. And I was the first one to say that I believe we have an African-American person as our sniper. And in fact, we may even have two snipers, and there may be an age difference between them. And that's all just based on the language. Not based on the tarot card, which was the first writing left behind, the scene of the school shooting where the young boy was shot but fortunately lived, and then other letters that came out of hanging on a tree in I guess it was Ashland, Virginia, and then the last letter, which was found up in Montgomery County. And there were some phone calls in between that they made. So I was the first one to say that. And of course, in every case, and I'm the first one to don't make forensic linguistics, the only thing you're working on here. And of course, there were other aspects of the D.C. sniper case where they were taking it, and they finally pieced together some things from Montgomery, Alabama, and there was an African American male seen running from that, and then John Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo was identified, and we put it all together from there. So I definitely work cases. They're the big ones that a lot of us have heard and read about over the years, but a lot of smaller, a homicide case is never small, but a lot of less notorious, if you will, homicide cases around the U.S. in which there were writings involved and in which my analysis, my report writing, if not my testimony, actually helped put someone in jail for life. So, yeah, basically, and any FBI agent knows this, if you somehow come up with a novel, distinctive, maybe even a unique way of solving the case, some method, some mode, some, scientific way or artful way, if you will, and you're successful with it, you get an arrest, a conviction is upheld on appeals, whether you like it or not, you become the expert in that field. So, after Unabomber and these other cases came along, I realized I'm getting these cases now assigned to me. Detectives are calling me up. Hey, an agent has a cousin in another division that told me you're like an expert with like looking at letters and documents. I said, well, I guess that's me. Yeah. So bottom line, I realized I was good at this in a very natural and sort of, inherent way. But I realized if I wanted to be taken serious in the area of text analysis or even progress it to forensic linguistics, I got to go back to school. So in my late 40s, the FBI gave me sort of a scholarship. They don't really word it that way, but they agreed to, pick up my tuition on a semester by semester basis. And I found that Georgetown University had a very well-renowned, worldwide renowned linguistics department. And I signed up and I took one course per semester. It took me 5 years, but I eventually got my second master's degree in linguistics from Georgetown University. Thank you, FBI. I do appreciate that. And then it wasn't until that point in time, until I held that degree in hand, that I officially considered myself a forensic linguist. And certainly from that day on, I have been. And I've had great success in the field. Some cases you never hear about. Some now work with the private sector. Nothing ever goes public. But I help them isolate a certain employee and take it from there. But it's all based on pretty much the same methodology I employed in the Unabomber cases, looking at stylistic features of individual writers. And you probably heard the term a number of times in the miniseries, idiolect.
Right.
And that is an actual linguistic term. I didn't invent it. Linguists before me did. And it is a personal dialect. It is how someone speaks or writes, which carries sort of their life story behind them if you have enough writing to go on. And, if you guys are from the Pacific Northwest or some other part of the Western U.S., you're going to have certain features in your speech and writing that may differ from someone from Boston or from the South, from Texas, anything like that. I was born and raised in Philadelphia, and yes, my fellow citizens of this area still pronounce H2O as water. These are people with PhDs, they're medical doctors, they're not dumb people, but we say water. I've sort of corrected over the years, since I talk all around the world now and give, presentations and speeches, so I do try to focus on water. But that was a moment at Unabomber in the early days there when a few folks kind of laughed, oh, what are you, from New York? You say water. I said, no, I'm from Philadelphia, but actually you're right there. And boy, if they can pick up me being from at least that part of the country, there may be something to this whole thing with this Unabomber case. And let's look at some of the distinctive writing in the manifesto, including, guys, we haven't talked about this yet, but it really was in paragraph 185, well, you can't eat your cake and have it too.
Right.
And some other people did pick up on that before me, but I was the first one to focus on it and say, wow, this is like the only mistake this guy has made. But ironically, if you watch the series, it really wasn't a mistake because that's how it was first written, in the 16th century, early modern English, whatever it was. And then, of course, when I was looking at the writings of Ted Kaczynski, and we really didn't have that smoking linguistic gun that we wanted yet, so I was working with a prosecutor now. He said, yeah, this stuff is good, Fitz, you're coming up with, but it's not enough to make it an arrest warrant or even a search warrant. When I showed him the letter that Ted Kaczynski wrote and signed his name, a letter to the editor of the Saturday Evening Post from the early 70s, there it is. He ends it, anti-technology, anti-big business, blah, blah, blah. But you can't eat your cake and have it too. there it is again. I ran downstairs, showed it. Well, actually, I called a meeting of my bosses and this prosecutor, and I walked into the room, and the prosecutor said, "Fitz, we finally have made our case. Put that in writing, and let's get the search warrant." And it all came together after that.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. Now, just quickly before we go, the Jean Benet letter. What was your kind of little thought on that? Was it the mother, or who wrote it?
I figured once I opened that door, guys. Yeah. Unfortunately, if anyone's watched the CBS special from September of 2016, and I think you can still get it online. We put a lot of information out there over 2 nights, but the Ramsey family didn't like what they saw and what they heard, and they sued CBS as well as the 7 experts who were portrayed on the air, me being one of them, and I am unfortunately restricted from talking about that case. Sorry, guys, that's the one thing, at least for now, so far, that I can't talk about.
Wah, wah, wah.
Well, you can go back and watch the series.
Yeah.
And, you know.
You see, I remember I watched it, but I don't remember. That's the truth. I don't remember. We've seen so much on that case, and that I don't remember it anymore. Like what it was about.
Well, all I'll say is it's a young girl that was killed in her home, and it's very sad that it hasn't been resolved. And we were doing our best to try to do something about that. And let's hope someday, that it can in fact be resolved. But I'll just leave it at that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Now, Fitz, where can people get in touch with you and look at your book series?
Yeah, they can go to my website, jamesrfitzgerald.com. Pretty simple, just my name with middle initial there. And there's all kinds of information. I have bonus chapters there from all 3 books that, no charge or anything, just read them. My first book, I've always been a Jules Verne fan, and I loved growing up. I read Journey to the Center of the Earth. So I figured I am on kind of a journey, and I realized that shows about profilers do well if they have the word mind in them. So I decided I somehow had to get mind into my title of my book. So I figured A Journey to the Center of the Mind. And I kept it for all 3 books. There will be a 4th one, but for now there's 3 been published. And the first one is growing up in Philly in the 60s and 70s and, going to Catholic grade school and off to Penn State and some things I did right, some things I did wrong, and how I chose my eventual career. When you look back, guys, anyone who's listening, when you really think about it, some 18 or 19-year-old punk made a decision that affected you the rest of your life. And of course, I'm talking about the younger you. And punk is probably a giveaway to my age. You don't hear that word too much anymore. But which is what linguists do. We try to age the writer through lexical choices, of course. So it's a fun book about growing up. And my very first investigation at 6 years of age, and actually it was about a missing red 20-inch roll-fast bike that was stolen from me, not just missing. And I never did resolve who stole it, but through my investigation, which lasted about 3 days, going door to door, doing canvassing of the neighborhood, whatever, showing pictures of my bike that I happened to have from a photo album, I wound up finding the bike 3 days later. But I am still looking for the guy that stole it. So if you're out there and listening to Something Weird Media, I'm coming after you. So book 1 ends with me graduating the Pennsylvania State Police Academy. And the entirety of book 2 is my 11 years as a police officer in suburban Philadelphia in a town called Bensalem. And it's all kinds of cops and robber stuff, gunplay, car chases. I chased 2 brand new Trans Ams one night. That was a fun evening. And people can read about that. But also a lot of political issues right in the middle of it, with politicians being arrested for selling meth and P2P, PCP and all that stuff, and how dysfunctional the PD got for a while. But I eventually did what I had to do, and including writing those secret memos I was talking about, and I got through it. And book 3 is my first day in the FBI at the Academy. And there's a popular show out there now called Quantico, which, once again, Hollywood sort of takes some liberties with that. So the first 3 chapters are what it's really like to go through the FBI Academy. And I know that was the late 80s, but some of the training blocks have changed, whatever, but it's the same building, the agents, still dress alike. I was there back in September, and I said, oh, that was me, some 30 years ago. So the first 3 chapters is about that. The next 15 or so is my adventures in New York City, where I worked some mob cases and an FBI agent pedophile we had to arrest, and a serial killer case. And, and I mean, just about every kind of a criminal case. I was there for the first World Trade Center bombing. Other folks solved it, but I was there the first few days helping out. And then the last long chapter is my role in the Unabomber case. So, again, they're all called The Journey to the Center of the Mind, Book 1, Book 2, Book 3. If you go to my website, there's a thing you can fill out, and I'll actually mail you a signed copy of the book, once the check is received and stuff like that. So there is a way to get it that way. You can also get it on certainly Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It is at some bookstores. There's at least 3 or 4 different ways to get it there. But just contact me on my website, and we can go from there.
Great. And, of course, we'll have it linked to our webpage as well and the station page when it's up.
Great.
So it's certainly a pleasure to have you here. I think we could talk to you forever.
If I can quickly plug, guys, quickly plug 2 more shows coming up.
Okay.
I'm going to be one of the co-experts on a show called Notorious that'll air on Reels in the late winter, early spring. One-word title, Notorious, and there's 10 episodes, and we kind of assess and profile and break down like 10 different bad guys over the last 20 years or so, from D.B. Cooper to Ted Kaczynski to Jared Fogle to Anthony Weiner. It's kind of an eclectic choice of folks there.
I was going to say.
And actually, it is, and that's what attracted me to the show. So it was kind of fun to do that, including a woman named Blanco, who was like the only female head of a drug cartel in Colombia and southern Florida back in the 80s. And I actually do some research on her, and she's a very interesting character and responsible for a lot of deaths. And the other show is we're doing a season 2 of The Case of. So it was The Case of John Benet Ramsey, season 1. This will be the case of Kaylee Anthony, the young girl from 2008, of course, who was missing, her body found, her mother arrested, acquitted. We're sort of reinvestigating that case, bringing back the investigators, prosecutors, witnesses, other folks. And I'm actually in Florida. I was in Florida a few days earlier this week. I'll be back next week, again in January. And there's a lot of documents and spoken words and 911 calls that I'm giving sort of a linguistic analysis of those. So that'll be on the Oxygen Network sometime, I think, in April of 2018. So
Great.
Have your listeners keep on top of this. Maybe we can talk again.
Oh, yeah. I was going to say, we'll have you on and work it.
Sure.
We love those cases. And, wow, that's really good. Are you going to get to talk to Anthony, the mother? Casey Anthony?
We're still, the producers are still working on a few of those things. There are some people they've reached out to and have agreed, but I'm not at liberty to go into all that. But we definitely have investigators. I think Jeff Ash is one of the prosecutors. He's already involved. There's a FBI agent who's still in the bureau, and he's going to be talking about it because he was involved in the case. I was already out of the bureau then, so I played no direct role. My good friend Jim Clemente, he's one of the writers for Criminal Minds. I also work on that show as a technical advisor, but he's one of the executive producers of this show, and he was still in the FBI in 2008, and he did assist the investigators when they came to Quantico on that matter. But obviously the case didn't go exactly where law enforcement wanted it, but we're going to try to work through it again and see what we can come up with.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Well, again, thank you for being on the show.
Alan and Kevin, you are very welcome. Something Weird Media, it's my new friends now, so I hope to hear from you guys again.
Absolutely. I'm sure you will.
To find out more about our show, guests, or to listen to past shows from our archive, please go to www.houseofmysteryradio.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.